Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this OECD Washington Center webinar on the Employment Outlook for 2020. I'm Miguel Gorman, Senior Public Affairs Manager at the OECD Washington Center, where our job is to communicate the work of the OECD to the US and Canada. We also act as a resource for legislators and the executive branch, the wider policy community, as well as the hundreds of US and Canadian government delegates who drive the work of the organization through its various committees in Paris. We are eager for you to engage with us, and we encourage you to visit our webpage at oecd.org/Washington to sign up for alerts and stay informed on information that's relevant to your work. Now, today we are joined by three distinguished speakers to talk about how the labor market is doing. We have OECD Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs, Stefano Scarpetta, AFL-CIO Chief Economist, Bill Spriggs, Shelly Steward, Associate Director of Research at the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative. And joining us for the Q&A is OECD's Stephane Carcillo, Head of the Jobs and Income Division. In a few moments, we will hear from Stefano, who will present the main findings of the Employment Outlook. And afterwards, we will hear perspectives from both Bill and Shelly. We will then move into a Q&A. And for the Q&A, please post your questions in the question box during the presentation and remarks. Please state your name, organization that you are representing, and then the question. We will do our best to get to as many as possible. If you have not yet seen the report that we're going to be talking about today, you can get it at oe.cd/EMO2020. That's oe.cd/EMO2020. Now, our first speaker is Stefano Scarpetta, the Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD. His brief also covers the OECD's work on health and international migration. Stefano has held several positions in the OECD, including in the Economics Department, as well as the directorate which he now leads. He also spent time at the World Bank, where he served as labor market advisor and lead economist. He has published extensively in academic journals and has edited several books in the fields of labor economics and industrial relations. Stefano, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Let me just share my screen with the presentation. I hope you can see the presentation. Good afternoon to everyone. It is really a great pleasure for myself and Stefano Carcillo, my colleague, to give you the highlights of the 2020 Employment Outlook. The Employment Outlook focuses, of course, on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis onto the labor market and the policy responses. But I just want to highlight that the report also includes a number of structural chapters on how unemployment benefits to support workers in non-standard form of employment. There's a chapter on employment protection legislation, there is a chapter on middle-skill workers, and there is a chapter about the labor market outcome of young people leaving technical and vocational education. The presentation I would like to share with you focuses exclusively on the labor market impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Let me start with the first observation, and this is shown in this chart, what presents the evolution of the unemployment rate in the OECD countries. And you can see very clearly that there's been a huge spike in unemployment in the OECD. Just yesterday, we released the May statistics. For the US, actually, we have the June statistics. And as you know, the unemployment rate in the OECD has moved from a record low level of 5.2% back in January of this year to a record high level of 8.4% in May. It was actually 1 decimal point higher in April, 8.5%. So basically, as you can see in this chart, we have wiped out in 3 months, since February, 10 years of improvements in the labor market. We are back to where we were more or less at the peak after the global financial crisis in 2010. Other point that we'll go back to pretty quickly is also that there are huge differences across groups, and we have seen a very significant increase in the youth unemployment. But we know very well that this chart hides very large differences across countries, which are shown in this chart. The bar is the May 2020, or the latest available information again for the United States is June 2020, and the little diamond you see is actually where we were back only a few months ago, in January of 2020. You can see that in the United States, of course, as you know very well, but also in countries like Colombia and Canada, there has been a very large increase in unemployment. We know that in the US, we moved from a record low level to a 14.7% in April of this year. And then there has been some significant improvement because in June, the latest observation is 11.1%. So there's been a significant decline in unemployment, mainly because many of those in temporary layoffs managed to go back into employment because with the reopening of the economy. You see that actually a number of other OECD countries, including a number of European countries, there's been very little increase in unemployment. Actually, in my own country, Italy, as well as in Portugal and in Greece, there has been a decline in the unemployment rate since January of this year. However, this should not be misled because to some extent behind the evolution of unemployment in this country in particular, there is a very large decline in participation rate. So a number of workers during the lockdown or the confinement period have actually left the labor market altogether instead of continuing to looking for a job and therefore be considered as unemployed. So large difference across the board, some mild sign of improvement in some countries, including Canada, the United States, and some even European countries, but certainly large increases in others. Now, one reason why the unemployment rate in general, specifically in the present circumstances, is not a good indicator of what's really happening on the labor market is because of the policy response that different countries put in place. In this chart, we show you the number of workers involved into the approved application for job retention schemes. These are programs that support companies in continuing to pay their salaries and therefore keeping the labor contract with their employees and of course supporting the income of the worker themselves. Now the number you see in this chart is something we have never seen before by a far amount. So in a country like New Zealand, the wage subsidies amount to 65% of the workforce. In a country like France, you're talking about 55% of the private sector employees be to some extent involved into the approved applications, 45% in Italy, and so on and so forth. So you see large use of job retention schemes in many countries, in Europe mainly, but also in New Zealand, as you can see here. Again, if I were to show you the figures for the period after the global financial crisis, you will be talking about a tiny fraction of these numbers. So something which is an order of magnitude lower than what we see now. Now, what I want to point out in this slide is also a little diamond, which is the white diamond. This basically is the actual use. So what companies do, they actually submit an application, but then only later they might actually use the scheme if you actually need it. Some companies, especially because this scheme were open to all sectors and all firms, did not manage to actually use the scheme because of delays in all the bureaucratic processes to actually processing their own application. So in a country like France or in Germany, only 60% of the approved application turn into the actual use of the job retention scheme. Yet you can see that many workers many jobs, I would say, were protected through the job retention scheme. Again, to a scale we have never seen before in any previous economic crisis. Now, the other important dimension of the adjustment has been not only on workers who have lost a job or those who have been supported by the job retention scheme, but actually by the significant drop in hiring. Here you have high frequency indicators that look at the average changes in daily job advertisement posted online in between February and June of 2020. You see that you're talking about a drop of 35%, a third, on average in the 18 countries for which we have the data, but also much larger drop in countries like Mexico, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Ireland. So there's been a massive decline, a freezing of hiring. And of course, it is a disproportionate effect on the young people and those who were unemployed and looking for a job. So the labor market has adjusted on the quantity side with job loss, on the extensive side with hours worked, but also by freezing the hiring to a significant extent. And even on the 1st of June, so the latest information we have, the hiring are very much down. So even at a time when the economy is reopening, many employers are very reluctant to open new job opportunities. So if we were to take all of this into account and we look at the extensive and intensive margin. So the extensive margin is how many jobs were lost. The intensive margin is that the decline in working hours for those who remain in employment. You end up with a chart like this that focuses only on a subset of OECD countries: Australia, Canada, Japan, Korea, Sweden, the United States. And again, just for a comparison point of view, we show you the evolution of hours worked, total hours worked during this COVID-19 crisis and after the global financial crisis. And as you can see, there has been a drop of, on average in these countries, of 12.2% in total hours worked in these countries, compared to 1.2% after the global financial crisis. Only a few months ago, we said that the global financial crisis was one of the worst crises we have seen in generations. Now, if you look at this chart, of course, you can see how much bigger this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has been compared to the global financial crisis. As to be said, this only focuses on the first 3 months since the outbreak of COVID-19, and of course, it looks at the period in which many of the activity was shut down. So, of course, hours collapsed much more than after the global financial crisis. So if we take all these total hours work for these countries, this would represent 50 million jobs potentially lost. But of course, a number of those who have seen working hours reduced have actually go back into employment or have increased the number of hours with the recovery, the timid recovery that we see in many countries. In fact, when we look at the evolution of working hours across countries, you see that in the United States, this is in the order of 16%. It is much larger in Canada, but is sizable also in other countries. Again, the little white diamond represents the changes we have seen after the global financial crisis. So altogether, massive reduction in working time, either because of people lost a job in some country like the United States, at least temporarily, or because people have kept their job, but have been forced to basically reduce dramatically the working hours, if not basically suspend any activity for those who could not actually do telework, who could not continue to work from home. Now, it is often said that the COVID-19 or the pandemic is actually symmetric. Everybody can be infected by the virus. But when we look at the impact on the labor market, this is hugely asymmetric. This is not new. We have seen that in previous crises. But perhaps this time around, we have seen a very disproportionate impact already onto some of the groups, some of which tend to be, to some extent, more disadvantaged than others, but also more broadly. So let me walk through, and we can elaborate more during the discussion. Low-paid workers. First of all, many of them are on the front line because they protect and they secure essential services, where, of course, in the health sector, but also in transport and other essential services. But also, they are 50% less likely to be able to work from home. And actually, in the evidence we have from the OECD countries, they were twice more likely to have stopped working completely, either because their job does not allow to be performed from home, or because they didn't have the right equipment, a computer, a tablet, or a fast connection to be able to do so. Second, and again, there are large differences across the board, are all of those that we characterize as being non-standard workers. So those, the self-employed, those on a fixed-term contract, those on a part-time employment, they have been disproportionately affected. First of all, because they account for 40% of the sector most affected by the crisis, basically all the service sector that have been hugely impacted by the crisis, and because they are less protected because of the nature of their contract. Just let me remind you that the self-employed in many countries do not have access to sick leave benefit like employees. To some extent, even those who have access to unemployment benefit might not be able to get it because of the lower contributions. The third group is the youth. Again, this is not surprising. We have seen that in previous crises, but young people have been disproportionately affected. One, because of course they were holding this temporary, more precarious job, and these were the first to actually not be renewed and therefore to be terminated, but also because entering the labor market in the present circumstances is very difficult. So you see the youth unemployment stood up from 11.2% in the OECD in February to 17.6% in May. So in a matter of a few months, a very large increase in youth unemployment. And of course, there is a very bleak prospect for the generation 2020, those who are leaving the education, moving to the labor market. Last but certainly not least, the other group disproportionate effect this time around are the women. As you know, they represent 2/3 of the health workforce, they represent something like 80% of nurses. At the same time, they are highly represented in sectors deeply affected by the confinement and the lockdown. And many, in particular single mothers, have to juggle job at home with actually family responsibility. So we have seen that the female unemployment rate increasing much more than the male unemployment rate. And this again is different from what we have seen after the global financial crisis, in which, given the nature of the shock, affected more manufacturing and other sectors that were more male, with a larger male presence. So the other important point I want to mention, again, the differentiation of the impact, is when we look at high earning workers that manage to work from home compared to the low earning workers. Here you have for the United States and for the average of the OECD countries, how many of them at the bottom of the income distribution, of the earning distribution, manage to, basically these are the ones that do not manage to continue to work. And you can see the United States and you see actually the OECD. So in the United States, 59% of workers in the top earning quartile reported working from home. So they were able to do telework in April compared to 34% of the workers in the bottom quartile. So the telework was used massively. About 1/3 of the workforce on average in the OECD countries managed to do telework, but this is very much differentiated across earning groups. Those at the high end of the earning distribution managed to do that disproportionately compared to those at the bottom of the earning distribution. Now, we also use high frequency indicators. These things are evolving so rapidly to look at the stay home and whether or not individuals manage to stay home. So we use the cubic mobility index. And here you have two lines. One is for the high income and one is for the lower income. You can see that for the higher income, it was much easier to reduce mobility, to stay home and to protect themselves than it was for the low income one. And when you look at the shelter in place, or the percentage of users saying that they were staying home, you can see again that the high income individual managed much more easy to stay home, to protect themselves and to continue to work from home compared to the low income one. So again, large differences looking at the earnings of workers, again, across a wide range of countries. Now, it's very difficult to make projections. For the first time ever, the OECD actually came with two scenarios which have equal probability, although a huge uncertainty surrounding both of them. One is called the single hit scenario. So these under the assumption that the OECD countries will manage to avoid a second outbreak, a second rapid, basically, diffusion of the virus. That would imply a further containment measures, a further lockdown down the road. And the second double hit is when this will not happen, and therefore we might have to, we see a second outbreak, a second rapid spread of the virus, which means that some containment measure would have to be reintroduced. You can see that even in the single hit scenario, we are talking about 31 million jobs being lost in the OECD by the end of this year, and 15 million still jobs less by the end of 2021. Now, of course, if we move into a double hit scenario, the scenario which is much worse because you see that there is a second dip into employment, and by the end of 2020, we might be 53 million jobs less. And even by the end of 2021, we might be 25 million jobs short compared to the situation prior to the COVID-19. So a major impact on the labor market. You see a slight recovery in employment, of course, but this is going to be very gradual. So by the end of 2021, whatever the scenario, we might be short of in between 15 and 25 million jobs. Now, let me move quickly into the policy responses, because I think if indeed the impact on the labor market and the economy has been unprecedented, so has been the policy response that most of the OECD countries put in place. So in this chart, we just show you the percentage of the OECD countries that introduced different measures in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. And you can see that all OECD countries have introduced some form of support to firms, financial support to firms, either through grants, loans, or tax and social security deferral. A very large proportion, as I said before, of countries have used job retention schemes, again, to a scale that has been certainly unprecedented in any of the previous crises. Many countries introduce income support for those who did not receive or were not entitled to receive the traditional income support, unemployment benefit. Many countries, of course, including the United States, have extended the coverage of sick leave. In the US, everybody was allowed 2 weeks of sick leave. Other countries have extended sick leave, for example, for the self-employed who were not used to receive sick leave benefits. So you see massive immediate response by many, if not all, countries of the OECD. A number of countries have also helped workers staying home by providing also support to families with kids since schools and kindergartens were shut down. Now, when we go forward, of course, this is a health emergency, is a health crisis. And of course, solving the job crisis also depends to some extent in addressing the health crisis. In the absence of a vaccine or an effective treatment, of course, the public health policies that most countries have in place are essential. This involves, of course, a test, track, and trace to a very large scale to identify those who might have the symptoms, to trace them, and to actually make sure those with whom they've been in contact can be identified and provide support and put in quarantine. Of course, this also involves relying on telework and making sure that SMEs could actually use telework. This also involves ensuring health and safety at work for those who are going back to work. And again, here, particularly is the support for the small and medium-sized enterprise, and continue to offer support for those who may fall sick or be in quarantine. So the basic leave, I think, is another important component. On the left-hand side of this chart, you have actually the number of workers who are at risk of infection because of the nature of their job. And you see these account for in between 50 and 40% of the workforce. For them, given the nature of the job, they might and they have to be exposed to some risk, and therefore they need to be protected. The other point I want to mention, I show you two charts very quickly, is the evolution of the unemployment insurance in the United States. You see the significant increase in the claims that was made as soon as the federal announcement was made. But actually the interesting point is that when then different states introduce specific lockdown, this is not necessarily amplified the extent of the nationwide shock. And this is something we see also look at other dimensions in other countries. So the announcement of the existence of this pandemic and the potential impact on the health of individuals already managed to produce a significant change in behaviors. Workers did not feel comfortable to go to work and they stay home if they could, and they reduced dramatically also their mobility. Again, if they could, because those who did not receive protection may have to be forced to continue to go to work and therefore to expose themselves to some risks. Now quickly, and perhaps this is an important final point I want to mention, is that how do we adjust the policies in the new phase many countries are in, mainly a phase in which we are reopening the economy, some sectors are regaining activity while others are still deeply affected by the existing confinement measures. And here I want to split in two blocks. One is what are the immediate measures which are needed, and the second part is more how do we build and rebuild a fairer and a more resilient labor market. So on the first part, I think depending on the countries, we have to review the coverage and the adequacy of the income support schemes as the economy reopens, and reassess the targeting of some of the emergency measures that were put in play. Some workers might not be able to regain employment and might be at risk of contracting the virus if they do so, given the working conditions. And therefore, they need to continue income support, including, for example, as in the United States, the extension of the unemployment benefit. The short-time compensation, which was given in many European and non-European countries to everybody, all firms and all workers, would have to be made conditional on co-payment or participation on the side of the employers in those sectors where economic activity are restarting, while possibly the short-time compensation should actually be kept, or the job retention scheme should be kept for those sectors where the activity is not resuming anytime soon. I think it's important to boost the capacity of benefit administration and actually scale up the employment support for the job seeker. One of the issues that we found in the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, was that resources for labor market programs did not increase in line with the increase in the number of clients and the number of unemployed. And therefore, in most countries, the resources available per unemployed declined dramatically, sometimes by 50%. So at the time when you need more resources to help the unemployed to go back into employment, there were fewer resources available for them. The second block actually focuses more on what it is that we have to do in order to build a better labor market. I mean, this crisis lay bare some of the pre-existing gaps in social protection. Some workers did not receive support because of the nature of their job, including self-employed, but other workers with different type of contract. The sick leave was not available for a number of workers. This was extended the coverage to all workers in the United States and many other countries. We have to build from this extraordinary measure to make sure we can create a better safety net that covers everyone. Second is actually that we have to establish a system to deliver timely employment support, notably again to the worker in non-standard form of employment. They have been the one I was saying before, deeply affected by the immediate impact of the COVID-19 crisis onto the labor market, and they're likely to be the one actually facing significant difficulties. One group in particular is the young people. For them, it's going to be a very tight, very difficult labor market. And what happened after the global financial crisis is that many countries intervened too late to help the young people. And basically this was after the youth unemployment reached a very high level and stayed there even well into the recovery after the global financial crisis. Last but certainly not least, there is an urgent need to invest in skilling and reskilling. Probably we will discuss that during our conversation today. Many jobs that are available were there before the COVID-19 may not resume in the aftermath of COVID. There will be new jobs being created and many workers would have to move into these jobs. I think it is perhaps more urgent than ever to invest in the human capital workers. Those who are still in employment may have to face a change in the type of job they're performing, but also those, of course, who have lost their job. So investing in training and retraining for both the employed persons, but also the unemployed is, in my view, essential. And in all of that, I think we need the social partners. We need the employers on board to basically take their own responsibility, both in terms of keeping the job that they can keep, but also invest in training and retraining for their workers. And of course, we need the unions, the trade unions, we need the worker association to actually, to the extent possible, participate in redesigning the labor market that will be possibly a better labor market compared to the one that was there before the COVID-19 crisis. So these were the main highlights. I try to go pretty quickly across them that I want to share with you, but I very much look forward with Stephane to your questions, your comments, and to the conversation we are going to have. Thank you.
Stefano, thank you so much for that interesting presentation. And for those of you tuning into the webinar, if you haven't already done so, you can start asking your questions by putting them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them during the Q&A portion of this webinar. Our next speaker is Bill Spriggs, Chief Economist to the AFL-CIO and Economics Professor at Howard University. In this role with the AFL-CIO, Bill also chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. Bill serves on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he was appointed as an Assistant Secretary at the US Department of Labor by President Obama, where he served from 2009 to 2012. Bill, it's great to have you. Over to you.
So there is a Q&A.
I think you're muted, Bill.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I got myself unmuted. So I want to thank the OECD for that wonderful presentation. Stefano, I think, covered most of the highlights. I'm going to try and be complimentary here since I know the slides he was going to cover and go through some details that I think are important to understand the US situation. So just again to recap, the initial job loss in the US, this is what things look like in April when we suffered the biggest part of the job loss. You will notice this little circle way out to the left in the far southwest corner. That is our leisure and hospitality industry, where mostly those are restaurant workers. And you can see this is 7 million and it's almost 8 million jobs being lost in that industry. This was the biggest area for job loss. This circle represents retail. If you're going down on their chart, you're going below the average wage in the US, up is above the average wage, and left is losing jobs. And This is the biggest job loss, and it is the lowest wage industry. And a typical year, so 2018 being a typical year, and the year we have complete information for, if you were unemployed in this industry, fewer than 8% of the workers got unemployment insurance. So you understand the crisis we face because we lost the most jobs in a low-wage industry where virtually no worker normally gets unemployment insurance. This is a huge challenge that we faced. Fortunately, the House of Representatives took the lead on this, and they quickly adjusted our unemployment insurance system, patching up a couple of problems that these workers face. Many of them are part-time. Our unemployment scheme is aimed at full-time workers, and it has an earnings test. And because these are the lowest earning workers, they, in many states, don't earn enough to qualify for regular unemployment insurance. So it was vital that we create a different unemployment scheme for them, pandemic unemployment assistance. Many people are misinterpreting that benefit and thinking these are all gig workers. They're thinking of Uber, Lyft, and things like that. But the predominant set of workers were these workers. In addition, we had to cover workers in our amusement industry and our artists, who actually are the old-fashioned gig workers. It comes from musicians who do gigs. So a different way of thinking about the US, this was in April when we suffered that job loss. So this is what our normal unemployment insurance system would have covered in terms of making up for lost payroll. And then here you have the extra $600 that was added to each unemployed person's check because the normal replacement rate in the US is very low. And the maximum benefit in most states comes to about $400. In order to cover the average worker in the US, you'd have to add $600 to that to get to the $1,000 the average American makes a week. And so this $600 was added because our system is so antiquated, we couldn't do an adjustment to say 100% replacement for all workers. So that was what the adjustment was. This is April. The pandemic unemployment assistance, which is supposed to help these restaurant workers, you see, was very slow to be taken up by the states, and it only makes up a small part of the unemployment insurance. But if you add these components up and think about it as wage subsidies, here is the loss in private sector wages that took place in April. This is what we're making up for with unemployment insurance. And so I think you could say the US adopted this model. That comes to, maybe 25, 30% of payroll. And so you can think in Germany, they're covering 30% of payroll through their short-term week compensation. So you could say, well, the US is doing something sort of comparable to Germany, but not quite really. And of course, there's the pain and the friction of the unemployment system and its inequities. One of the clear inequities is the rate at which states adopted. The southern states were very slow to do this. The majority of Black workers in the United States live in the South, and this has created a huge disparity, racial disparity, and who's getting unemployment benefits in the US. So this is among men. This bar, the white bar, represents the share of unemployed Black men who are getting unemployment benefits, which you can see is the lowest among any racial group. And this is a big effect of disproportionately living in the South. And this isn't a matter of applications. Blacks and whites are about equal to apply for benefits. Whites are far more likely to get benefits. And then this is the slide for women. Women are far less likely to get unemployment than men. And again, the group that is least likely among this group to get unemployment benefits are Black women. So it's a very uneven system, and it has affected groups differently. And ironically here, Blacks have the highest unemployment rates in the US, but have the lowest unemployment insurance recipiency. This is a huge problem going forward in terms of the shape of the recovery. The other problem that the US is going to have is the loss of jobs in local government. You can see during the Great Recession, this big dip This is unusual because you see typically in the US, we don't have losses of local employment. It did occur during the 1980s when we had that massive downturn, and it happened again during the Great Recession. But we've already lost all of those jobs in the local government ahead of them making adjustments to their budget. Our local governments must balance their budgets. They are going to force austerity on the nation because of the big drop that's about to occur in their expenditures. And we will have further downward pressure on employment because of this difficulty. Just again, a little more detail on some of what Stefano presented. When we look at reasons for unemployment in the US, these are folks who are on temporary layoff, and you can see how it spiked in the spring. This is in April. And since the recall of many workers, you see that that's fallen. The more troubling, though, is these are permanent job losers, and this is rising. And these are the folks that are of concern because we have two things going. We have a health crisis, but we also have job loss, which is attributed to the dramatic drop in aggregate demand for products across the board, putting us into a regular recession. So there are areas not affected by the inability to gather in groups of more than 12. This has to do with just a regular recession. This portends a real danger for our recovery because these permanent job losses are trending up. The other thing to do is our labor force flow data. So again, this is the giant spike when going from March to April, many people who had been employed were thrown into unemployment. You see the huge spike. That was about 17 million people who had been employed suddenly lost their job. And then they regained their jobs coming back. So we have a big turn down from that type of flow from employed to unemployed. But there's still a pretty big problem in terms of going from employed to unemployed. This number is still above 2 million. So there's still a large number of workers who are losing jobs, despite the fact that now we're getting the recall. The yellow line are the recalls. These are people going from, the yellow line is going from unemployment to employment, and you can see we're catching up. But this gap isn't anywhere near as big as this initial gap. And so this persistent job loss, people going from employed to unemployed, the white line, is still well above the 2 million a month. This is going to be a problem going forward. The other issue that was raised by Stefano is actually all American workers were not given paid sick leave. There were huge carve-outs. It only applied to small firms, and small firms were given great latitude in being carved out from having to cover their workers. It did not cover large employers. And so this is the incident of workers who showed 2 or more symptoms, and they were asked in a survey about symptoms that they displayed. Separate question was, did you go to work last week? And so this yellow bar is showing you the share of workers who showed symptoms but went to work. And you can see it's kind of disturbing among men that we're getting 4 or 5% of workers who had symptoms but still reported to work. But this is far more common among women. So you can see for Hispanic women, it's almost 18% exhibited symptoms but went to work anyway. For Black women, it's around 12.5%. This is the problem without having enough sick leave and workers fearing in this environment that if they don't show up to work, that they're going to be in big trouble. So they're going to work even though they are exhibiting symptoms. Stefano made a great point about workers and exposure. Unfortunately, in the US, they made a big deal about Black workers, and a lot of things about the deaths for Blacks is because they somehow or another, Black workers have too many complicated diseases, and that complicates the exposure to COVID. This really is not true. Going across the states where we get a report on both getting the disease and dying from disease by race, you can see that, yes, there are some states, Kansas is one, where Blacks make up a much higher share of those who die from COVID than those who catch COVID. The bar one here would be the same share of Blacks who get the disease die from the disease. So that would mean the death rate would be the same. So it is true that in some states like Kansas, it is higher, but do you see how many states are well below the one bar? So you have a state like Pennsylvania where Blacks make up a far smaller share of those who die than those who catch the disease. So it really has nothing to do with these comorbidities. It really has to do with what Stefano was mentioning before. And that's the item we need to concentrate on going forward, which is what share of workers are out and working and required to work. For the sake of time, and I'm trying to wrap up really quick here, I didn't put up a chart from our National Employment Law Project, which is a think tank here in Washington, but the retaliation against workers who report safety violations is huge in the US, and it is particularly vicious against Black workers who complain about safety conditions. We have a huge problem. Our Occupational Safety and Health Administration has refused in this instance to have specific regulations put in place to keep workers safe. The AFL-CIO, in fact, has sued them over this. Unfortunately, the courts decided, oh, that's okay, we don't have to have regulations, even though during the H1N1 crisis that we went through in 2009, OSHA did issue specific regulations because of the nature of that virus. And again, this is important for us to keep in mind. Safety going forward is what's going to provide stability for a recovery, and it's necessary that we fight the disease, and the safety of workers at work is paramount to fighting the disease. The reason for that is the angst that workers are feeling. This is my last slide. And you can see from our Census Bureau that does these pulse surveys, you can see this sudden spike among Asian American, Black Americans, and Hispanic Americans, and a fear that they are potentially going to face a job loss. This uptick, this uncertainty is what freezes demand. And that uptick that has started in June is going to continue weak demand and make the bigger recovery difficult to achieve. So I want to thank very much the OECD for their outlook. It highlights importantly the ability of other countries to respond to this because they engage in tripartite agreements all the time. And therefore they were much more quick to pull together the necessary parties to come up with solutions to keep workers tied to their employers, and they will be more successful coming out of this because of that. We've encouraged the OECD to monitor all of these things, keeping in mind the great work that they have been doing on the importance of collective bargaining and of social partners coming together to solve these kind of difficult questions of that need the cooperation of workers, and as was mentioned, going forward with training and other things for the recovery. So I want to stop there and thank everyone.
Bill, thank you. It's great to have your perspective. We're going to move now to our final speaker, Shelly Steward. Shelly is an economic sociologist who studies the changing nature of work in American society. She serves as Associate Director of Research for the Aspen Institute Future of Work Initiative, where she focuses on non-standard work, workplace benefits and protections, and the gig economy. She also teaches at the University of California's Washington Center. Her research considers how people understand their position in the labor market and how they navigate increasing insecurity. Shelly, I now turn to you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you to our previous speakers as well and the OECD for putting out this really interesting report. We're facing an unprecedented period of overlapping emergencies, a global pandemic, an economic crisis, and unparalleled racial and economic inequality. And at the same time, we're seeing a range of policy interventions aimed at these challenges. And the OECD report allows us to better understand the variation of these responses around the world and what we can learn from that variation. I'm going to keep my comments relatively brief and provide a bit of historical context to the current challenges. So although the extent and the simultaneity of these crises are really unprecedented, the underlying challenges are not all that new. In a lot of ways, we're seeing the culmination of shortcomings that have been building up for decades, and especially a projection of risk onto individuals and the erosion of workplace protections and of social insurance programs. So the issue of unemployment insurance for non-standard workers, which is something that the report spends quite a bit of time on, speaks to a gradual yet dramatic shift of risk onto individual workers and their families that's been happening over the past several decades and happening around the world, although probably most acutely here in the US. And it's true, we do need to consider unemployment insurance policies for non-standard workers. And the Future of Work initiative at Aspen has done quite a bit of work here looking at the portability of benefits, including unemployment insurance. So we need to look at developing programs that address work arrangements that are left out of traditional programs. So pandemic unemployment assistance, part of the CARES Act, did this looking at extending UI, unemployment insurance, to self-employed workers. We also need to consider how the current eligibility structure includes or excludes employees. So programs administered by the states were revised in recent decades to keep people off of benefits rather than facilitating eligibility in times that they need it most, like the current crisis. The application process is unnecessarily complex, and administrative resources are very scant. So applicants have faced months of delays. It's been really impossible for them to get through when they need help. We've talked to people like a driver in California who just had a simple question about a name change and called every day for months, unable to get an answer and therefore not getting benefits that allow him to pay rent and get groceries for his family. So revising unemployment insurance and considering or expanding work sharing programs, as several countries in Europe have been really successful with, considering job seekers allowances and programs for non-standard and self-employed workers like pandemic unemployment assistance. Those are all necessary to kind of revise and renew unemployment insurance and allow it to cover workers today. But we also, at the same time, need to more holistically consider ways to counter this shift of risk and rebalance risk with power. So right now, employers and companies hold quite a lot of power with relatively little risk of day-to-day life, whereas workers hold increasing amounts of risk with decreasing amounts of power. So on one hand, we need safety net programs that hold employers accountable for risks. So this includes UI and ensuring employers are paying into UI, looking at paid leave and ensuring that all workers have access to paid leave without any fear that taking advantage of that would cause problems for them, generous and transparent workers' comp programs, things like that. And at the same time, so that's the risk side of the risk-power balance, but we also need to ensure that workers can build and employ power in the workplace. So we've heard from workers, and Bill mentioned as well, workers organizing to demand protective equipment and hazard pay, and then facing retaliation from their employers. And these workers, they need the protective equipment, they need hazard pay, but they also need the right to ask for it without risking their jobs. So these are problems that have been building for decades. The lack of protections, the lack of enforcement of the protections that do exist, inadequate safety net programs, and importantly, the inequality of these problems. In a reversal of what we should see, programs tend to leave behind those who are already most vulnerable. So in the US, it's the lowest income workers, those with unpredictable schedules, Black and Latinx workers disproportionately not being helped by these programs, as Bill pointed to again, those lacking documentation who are often left out entirely. So given both the urgency of the current moment and the historic roots of the problems we face, we need immediate solutions that can also lead to some long-term changes. And right now, the immediate solutions are about public health at least as much, if not more than any type of economic recovery. That means providing cash so people aren't going to work if it's not safe to go to work. Depending on the context in the US, depending on which state, the question very well may not yet be how do we get people back to work? It might be how do we actually prevent them from working when it is unsafe and when going to work is a risk to the lives of themselves and to others in their communities. We need housing and food programs to ensure basic needs are being met. And for those who do go into work, we need workplace safety laws and adequate enforcement. And that enforcement might mean closing workplaces that have demonstrated a lack of compliance with safety regulations. And as we think about these immediate public health solutions, it's also the time to be building the long-term solutions that are about creating equitable safety net programs and rebalancing that risk-power equation. And both of these need to be rooted in equity. So it's not enough to ask if programs are accessible to everyone, but we need to ask how structural inequalities are being countered by these programs and countering things like occupational segregation that has been isolating vulnerable workers in certain low-paying occupations for generations. As we face this sort of double challenge of immediate solutions and long-term reforms, we are seeing a willingness to consider policies that in many ways are a substantial departure from the past. So as the OECD report points to, we're seeing cash transfers in a number of countries. We're seeing a conversation around the $600 a week federal pandemic unemployment compensation as highlighting the problems with low wages. You know, the problem is not that the unemployment insurance benefits are too high, it's that in many cases the wages of the jobs folks would be looking to return to are far too low to support themselves. So as difficult as this current moment really is, there are paths forward that can address some of these immediate needs and importantly and hopefully build us towards a more resilient and equitable society. So I will leave it with those thoughts and look forward to hearing some of our listeners' questions.
Shelly, thank you. We appreciate you sharing your perspective. Let's launch straight into the Q&A. We have a question here about how older workers fared in the period covered in the report. Stefano and Stephane, can I put that question to you guys?
Sure. That's an important question for which I don't have a full answer. So I guess this again will depend across countries. On the one hand, we know that older workers tend to be more represented in more stable jobs. So jobs, at least in many countries, that have an open-ended contract, while of course the young people tend to be highly represented more the more temporary fixed-term contract. So from that point of view, again, drawing from the experience also of the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, older workers were somewhat more protected by the immediate impact in terms of job losses. On the other hand, of course, many workers in many sectors have been asked to work from home, and therefore the ability of some older workers, especially those with low skills, to be able to telework and to use the digital technology effective might be sort of an issue. And of course, let's not forget that the complications related to the COVID-19 virus are hugely differentiated across age groups. So most of the complications are actually for older workers, and therefore a number of older workers unfortunately fell sick, and in particular if they contracted the virus may have a significant complication. So from the health point of view, there is a huge impact on all the workers and all the people in general. In terms of the labor market situation, labor contract, they might be sheltered somewhat more than workers, younger workers, for example.
Great, thank you. We also have a question addressed directly to Dr. Spriggs. Could you expand upon the potential long-term ramifications of local government employment cuts?
Well, it's the tip of the iceberg of cutbacks and investments that we need our local governments to continue to make. We just had our state and local governments fully re-engage in the economy in the last 2 or 3 years. They went through an entire period of austerity, and just now we're starting to see roads being replaced, schools being built again. And so these are the tip of the iceberg of another set of years of lost opportunities for the type of investment we know need to be made. And more particularly, we uncovered huge gaps. Here we are well into the 21st century, and we fully got to appreciate that we couldn't do distance learning because the children didn't have the computers. We don't have the broad bandwidth for them to participate in distance learning. All of these things are going to slow down the recovery as we go forward. And it will be very deep. I mean, just imagine that you're a governor and you're faced with massive cuts. Their budgets are being cut by billions of dollars, billions. The first thing I'm going to do is we're not ordering cars for our state police because that's the easiest thing not to order. This is a tremendous impact as you think on the easy things they can cut, since they must still maintain healthcare. The Medicaid program, the health insurance for low-income people in the U.S., is funded through the states. The states are receiving a match to help them with that, but this is a big thing they have to do. Higher education. Many states have already started cutting budgets for their state universities. We see some of those lost jobs. Those were workers at state universities, and they're already cutting the salary for some of their professors. And then they run prisons. And so there's not a lot of room in that to make cuts. And some of those have deeper ramifications. There will be no state regional meetings, right? That's another thing that governors tend to leave out. So for those local hotels that used to host regional meetings in the state, they won't be filled. That will slow the recovery. So this austerity at the state and local level is huge. They are an important part of the infrastructure that the U.S. depends on. Most of the roads that you drive on in the U.S. are local roads, not the interstate highways. The schools, our entire K through 12 is a local investment. Our state universities are state and local investments. These are crucial investments for the future of the country. Putting them on hold is not a good idea.
Great, thank you, Bill. We have a question about the gig economy. How do you see the crisis transforming the way people are thinking about workplace protections for those self-employed people in the gig economy? Shelly, I'd like to put that to you.
Sure. So we have the gig economy. We're looking at workers working on online apps. You know, these are the folks bringing Instacart grocery deliveries. We're seeing increased awareness of the need of these workers to have protections, to have access to benefits, which they have traditionally lacked. A piece of this is addressing classification and how these workers are classified. And then for those who are working independently, how can we develop ways of getting them benefits and protections to ensure safe workplaces? This is where ideas of portable benefits come in. We've seen Seattle pass a portable paid leave provision for gig economy workers, as well as hazard pay for the delivery drivers. So we're seeing some exciting innovation looking at expanding protections to those folks.
Great, and if I can follow up really quickly on that, because there's a related question that just came in. What long-term changes would you like to see to the safety net that could be enacted now?
Increasing the universality and accessibility of programs, as well as the the generosity of the programs that do exist. So ensuring that workers across arrangements, across sectors, across occupations have access to key benefits. In the US, that's health insurance, in addition to paid leave, to unemployment insurance, to these programs that can provide security and stability at times when workers need them most.
Great, thank you. I am conscious of the time since we are coming up to the end of our allotment for this webinar, but if our panelists are all okay for time, do we have time for a couple of more questions?
I'm from our side, Miguel.
Fantastic, great. We have a question here. How do we make the case for work shares in an environment in which companies' revenues have suffered? In Europe, work shares are a collaboration between employers and governments. What is the model we can pursue in the US? And I'll put that to anyone who wants to answer.
Well, we have work sharing in over half our states. The problem is they envision full-time work, and the companies that have been laying off the most workers are restaurants that normally employ part-time work. So it's difficult to implement the plans for those industries of retail and leisure and hospitality where we lost the most workers. The key ingredient, though, is that in other countries, it involves labor unions. And to me, it's like, it's a wonderful idea, let's do it, because look at what they do in Germany. And as I pointed out to folks, that's like, I love cake, it's wonderful, but do you really have to have flour? Do you really have to have eggs? And do you really have to mix the batter? I mean, that's how vital unions are to making that system work. And we just get the part where, oh, there's icing and it's a sweet thing to eat, but you got to put the work in. Until we can get collective bargaining higher, we don't have the parties to come to the table and figure this out. There is some pending legislation to try and make short time more flexible. I mean, ironically, in the case of the US, the $600 push-up that all workers get if they are getting unemployment insurance applies even if they are on short time. So there are some states that are taking advantage of this, and rather than lay off their workers, they've done short time. The workers are getting the unemployment benefit to make up for the lost hours plus the $600. And so actually the way the scheme was developed here in the US for this emergency, the $600 is an incentive for everybody to sit down at the table and make short work really the rule. But when you look at our data, and Stefano had that in the chart, it's not even 1% of the unemployment benefits we're paying. It's a fraction of 1%. It's not 1%. It's below 1%, as his charts indicate. So it would be a change in philosophy and a much bigger commitment on the United States to have workers at the table bargaining.
If I may add something on this issue to what just Bill said, it's indeed a very different system in the US, where the protection has been organized outside the firm primarily, with all the limitations that Bill just mentioned. Another factor that actually pushes also firms not to recourse to the existing short-time work scheme is the fact that the employment protection legislation is very different in the US than in most European countries, where it is quite costly to terminate a permanent contract. So you have, in the very short term, when you want to react to a big decrease in your demand, you have a very strong incentive to recourse to these short-time work schemes that are subsidized by the state, and which actually protects the labor contracts. Whereas in the US, you don't have that that strong incentive stemming from the protection of employees. The US has tried to make up with this difference by creating a number of programs, such as, for instance, the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. The budget is huge on the paper. I think it's more than $300 billion for this program. but it's designed in a very different way compared with Europe. Because, for instance, the BPP functions as a loan, which can be cancelled, basically, if firms meet a number of conditions, notably to maintain employees at the end of the loan period. And this is not very suitable for very small firms, for instance, those in the hotels and the cafes and the restaurants, which probably have no visibility at the end of the loan to make sure that it will not have to repay the loan. And in most European countries, you don't have this conditionality on short-time work schemes. Companies are just helped for the time being in the hope that that will actually maintain the contracts even after the end of the support, but they don't have the obligation to repay the state in case they have to shut down or terminate a number of contracts. And I think that makes a big difference for the small companies Bill just mentioned.
Great, and still on the topic of work shares, here a related question. How do we improve the 27 existing work share agreements operated by states? They exist, but are underutilized.
Well, I think you heard in the last two answers the pretty big plug in, and this is the other thing I think the OECD should look at carefully. It really is important that in the US, from the firm's perspective, it is relatively costless to get rid of workers. There's very little cost to getting rid of workers, and American firms are so biased at the drop of a hat to get rid of workers first and think about it second. And as was mentioned, in Europe, that's not as easy to do. We and the labor movement have fought long and hard with the OECD to think about this. This is the second downturn in which the U.S. firms overreacted in terms of letting workers go, because that's their first instinct. And you can see from the quick rebound in hiring, just as with the Great Recession, the U.S. was very quick to bring back workers, but it's hard once you've overcorrected. It has ramifications for the macroeconomy. And so even if you are quick to try and bring workers back, you've created too many ripple effects of having let them go in the first place. A problem is, because it is state by state, if I'm a company operating in 3 states and I have these factories, I have to figure out how do I make short-time work fit each of those state short-time work laws. And so it is complicated for American firms. We really need to have a federal unemployment insurance system. It would then be easier for firms operating across states to implement the laws. And again, the missing ingredient for America is a lot of the short-time work involves agreements about protecting workers, and you really need a union to be at the other side to make sure that that happens. So it's hard for a firm to do it unilaterally.
Miguel, maybe if I can intervene for a second. One of the messages we have in the Employment Outlook is also to build a better labor market going forward, and therefore to invest more on resilience, on the resilience of the labor market. And I think the job retention scheme, the short-time working scheme, I think are an important component of this resilience. I think what we have seen very clearly in all the countries of the OECD is that those countries that already had the short-time work scheme, so the job retention scheme, actually use it effectively. And actually companies knew exactly how the system worked, how to apply for it, how to get the funds quickly. And therefore these save millions of jobs. If you introduce a scheme in the midst of a crisis, it takes time, especially for small and medium-sized enterprise, to understand how the system works, how to apply for it, what are the conditionalities, and so on and so forth. So to some extent, we need a battery of programs that may be dormant in good times, in normal times, but they're ready there to actually be activated when a crisis like this actually hit. And this actually is a very special one, because it was not because of the lack of demand, but government have asked companies to shut down. So company could not operate in many countries, and therefore at the same time, government were providing support to save the labor relation, the labor contract with many jobs. So I think the point we are making in the employment outlook, actually we've been making them before in the job strategy, is that we need a number of programs that might not be activated in good times, in normal times, but they're there and they are well known by all the stakeholders, including of course through collective bargaining, so that when a crisis hit, can be used and they're known. So there's no learning process is needed on, especially again on some of the more vulnerable actors, including the small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, the problem is that even if we look at Europe, what the European countries have done, they've extended the job retention scheme to all companies, all sectors. But when you look at those who actually really benefited from are the traditional sector, the manufacturing sectors. In the service sector, take-up rate has been much lower, precisely because companies in this sector were not used to the job retention schemes. And by the time they get to understand exactly how the scheme works, maybe a month or two had gone by.
Great, fantastic. Unless anyone else wants to weigh in, I think we probably need to wrap up the Q&A as we're way over our time. But I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and thank you to Stefano, Bill, and Shelly for speaking today. And for those of you who have further questions, and for those that we didn't get to, please do send them to washington.contact@oecd.org, and we will be happy to answer them. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the OECD website soon. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone with the link. And thank you all again, and I look forward to seeing you at the next OECD Washington Center event.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Shelly. Thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.